He was known as a devoted priest, respected, admired, and trusted by his parish. To the outside world, he was everything a shepherd of souls was meant to be: gentle in his words, steady in his duties, and faithful to the prayers entrusted to him. But inside, something had begun to break long before anyone noticed. What started as small doubts, tiny cracks in his spiritual foundation, slowly grew into a quiet storm that consumed him from within. At first, he tried to push the doubts away, treating them like passing shadows. He kept preaching, kept celebrating Mass, kept hearing confessions, but each ritual felt increasingly hollow, as if the words he recited were no longer supported by the conviction that once filled his heart. The grace that should have flowed naturally now felt distant, unreachable. He began to pray less, not because he didn't want to, but because he feared the silence that answered him back. Over time, discouragement hardened into despair. He hid his turmoil well, wearing a mask of calm that fooled everyone around him. Only God saw the weight he carried, the crushing fear that he no longer believed what he preached. Nights that once brought peace became hours of restless pacing, questions echoing in his mind. He wondered if he had failed God, or if God had somehow abandoned him. But the truth was far more painful. He had slowly abandoned himself. He allowed disappointment, exhaustion, and spiritual dryness to take root, telling no one, seeking no help. His vocation, once a bright flame, had dimmed into a flickering ember. This was the man Padre Pio would one day encounter, not a sinner by scandal, but a priest trapped in a silent crisis of faith, fighting a battle no one knew he was losing. When the priest finally came to Padre Pio, he did so out of habit, not hope. It was a routine visit, something expected of a man in his position. To anyone else, he appeared calm and composed, another priest seeking counsel. But the moment he stepped into the room, Padre Pio felt something profoundly unsettling. It wasn't sin in the usual sense. It wasn't rebellion or malice. It was absence. A deep spiritual void where faith, grace, and conviction were meant to reside. Padre Pio later described this sensation as if someone had walked in carrying a candle whose flame had already gone out. The wick was still warm, but the light was gone. The man spoke politely, respectfully, even with a hint of forced cheerfulness. But his soul told a different story. Padre Pio sensed no malice, no corruption, only a cold emptiness, an inner darkness formed not by evil but by exhaustion and spiritual abandonment. It was as if the man had been walking for years through a desert without water, surviving not on faith but on memory alone. Padre Pio looked at him with deep compassion. He saw not a priest but a wounded soul barely holding on to its vocation by a thin, frayed thread. He realized that the man had been functioning, but not believing, serving, but not trusting, preaching, but not feeling the presence of God he spoke of. Most people seek guidance hoping to be healed, but this priest came with no such expectation. He had accepted his spiritual emptiness as permanent, something he simply had to endure. He believed he was beyond help, but Padre Pio saw beneath the surface. In the silence of that first encounter, he perceived the truth. This man had not lost faith suddenly. It had drained out of him drop by drop until only a quiet, aching hollow remained. As the priest continued speaking, Padre Pio's earthly senses faded into the background. What emerged before him was not the man's face, but his soul revealed in a clarity that only God could grant. It appeared as a dim, wavering light, like a candle struggling to survive against a cold, relentless wind. The flame flickered weakly, shrinking each time a shadow passed over it. Padre Pio understood immediately. This was the soul of a priest whose faith had once burned brightly, but had been slowly suffocated by years of hidden despair. Around the fading light, Padre Pio saw figures that resembled silhouettes, shadows formed from doubt, fatigue, disappointment, and spiritual dryness. They weren't demons attacking him, but accumulations of unresolved struggles that had grown into oppressive burdens. Each shadow pressed closer, dimming the fragile flame even further, feeding on moments of weakness the priest never spoke of. They represented every unanswered prayer, every moment of loneliness, every fear he had buried beneath his priestly duties. The most heartbreaking part of the vision was that the flame was not completely gone. It still fought. It trembled. It stretched upward, seeking warmth, seeking God, seeking a spark to revive it. But it was faint, so faint that anyone without Padre Pio's sight would have believed it had died long ago. Padre Pio realized the tragedy of this soul. The man had not rejected God. He had simply gone numb. His vocation had become a routine, his prayers mechanical, his hope exhausted. The light within him dimmed not out of rebellion but out of silent suffering. Yet even in this weakened state, Padre Pio sensed potential, if only the priest could recognize that his fading flame was not a sign of failure, but a plea for renewal. The soul had not died. It was calling out for rescue. Padre Pio knew he could not remain silent. What he had seen in the priest's soul was not simply weakness, it was a slow spiritual death that could still be reversed. But only if the man confronted the truth he had been avoiding for years. With gentle firmness, Padre Pio leaned forward and spoke his name, breaking through the priest's practiced mask of calm. The priest looked up, surprised by the intensity in Padre Pio's eyes. Padre Pio did not accuse him or shame him. Instead, he began by acknowledging the man's pain. He told him that God had seen every moment of his struggle, the dryness in prayer, the fatigue of his ministry, the nights when he questioned his own calling. Padre Pio spoke as one who understood the weight of spiritual battles, and his compassion disarmed the priest's offenses. For the first time in years, the priest felt someone truly saw him. But after the compassion came the warning. Padre Pio explained that a priest's soul is meant to be a vessel of light, and when that light fades, darkness rushes in to fill the void. He told him that losing faith is not an event, it is a slow drifting, a gradual surrender to despair disguised as routine. And if left unaddressed, it leads to an existence where the soul forgets how to reach for God at all. Then came the invitation, simple, direct, and filled with urgency. Padre Pio urged him to return to prayer not as a duty, but as a plea for rescue. He encouraged him to bring his doubts to God instead of hiding them, to ask for grace even when he could no longer feel it. He reminded him that God does not abandon his priests. It is the priest who must take the first small step back. In that moment, Padre Pio offered him a choice: remain in silent darkness or reclaim the flame that still flickered within. The decision, he said gently, would shape not only his vocation but his eternity. Padre Pio understood something the priest could not yet see. A vocation is not merely a role performed on earth, it is a spiritual bond, a calling that echoes into eternity. When a priest slowly abandons his faith, the consequences reach far beyond his ministry. They shape the destiny of his soul. As Padre Pio gazed at the fading flame within him, he saw what would happen if the man continued on this path. He saw a soul drifting further and further from the warmth of God, not because God pushed him away, but because the priest no longer reached toward the light. His spiritual numbness would become a permanent state, a coldness that thickened like fog until the soul forgot what grace felt like. A priest's heart is meant to burn brightly, but when that flame is neglected, darkness becomes familiar, even comfortable. Padre Pio knew that at the moment of death, a soul weakened by years of doubt struggles to rise. It does not leap toward God. It hesitates, held down by the weight of despair it never confronted. The tragedy is that heaven is always willing to help, but a soul must still choose it. Yet Padre Pio also saw hope. The flame had not gone out entirely. It trembled, desperate for one breath of grace to revive it. And God, in His infinite mercy, was waiting for the smallest act of trust. Padre Pio's final message was clear. Losing faith is not final unless the soul chooses to remain lost. Even the faintest spark can become a fire again if the heart turns back before it is too late.